It began with a glare of red and white, the rising sun slicing through the clouds above Tokyo. Stock tickers froze, traders gasped, and the world's headlines turned crimson. On that morning, Japan's newly elected Prime Minister Sai Takai, barely 6 months into office, did what no leader in Tokyo had dared to do since 1945. She looked Washington in the eye and said one word that would shake the global order: no. Within minutes, the Nikkei surged, the yen soared, and across Asia, screens lit up in disbelief. For decades, Japan had been the model ally, reliable, obedient, and economically tied to America's every move. But when Donald Trump imposed 35% tariffs on Japanese cars, chips, and machinery, Tokyo's patience snapped. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about identity, sovereignty, and pride. That single act of defiance marked the beginning of a new era, one where the world's third-largest economy would no longer be defined by compliance, but by conviction. And as the sun rose higher over the Pacific, one question echoed across continents. If Japan could stand up to the United States, could others follow? This is cross-border news, and today, we uncover how Tokyo just rewrote the rules of global power. It began like a spark in a dry forest, one executive order that set fire to decades of cooperation. At 9 a.m. Washington time, Donald Trump signed what he proudly called an act of economic patriotism: a 35% tariff on Japanese cars, semiconductors, and industrial components. But behind the slogans and the cameras, it was a declaration of war on one of America's oldest allies. In an instant, more than $120 billion in annual trade was thrown into chaos. Factories that once powered both economies suddenly froze. Cargo ships carrying Toyotas and Sony electronics were ordered to hold position mid-Pacific. Markets convulsed. Toyota lost $18 billion in value overnight, Sony nearly $9 billion, and Panasonic tumbled 11%. Detroit celebrated, convinced that Japan's pain meant America's gain. But Wall Street saw the storm coming. Economists warned it would add $4,000 to the cost of an average U.S. car and send ripple effects through every supply chain from Seoul to Singapore. The irony was hard to miss. The very tariffs designed to protect American workers were inflating prices for American families. Across Asia, currencies trembled and trade routes faltered. What began as an economic dispute was quickly becoming a geopolitical earthquake. In Tokyo's parliament, the mood was not panic, it was defiance. Lawmakers called it what it was: economic warfare. Japan had been through worse. Bombed, rebuilt, and reborn. And this time it wouldn't kneel. While Trump's order aimed to corner Tokyo, it only awakened something far more dangerous: a renewed sense of pride. Japan would no longer be treated as Washington's junior partner. The next move wouldn't be loud. It would be precise, deliberate, and world-shaking. Because in Tokyo's mind, tariffs weren't barriers, they were motivation. When Prime Minister Sai Takai stepped before the national parliament, the chamber fell silent. Cameras flashed, and for a moment the air in Tokyo felt electric, charged with something Japan hadn't shown in decades: open defiance. Then came the sentence that would echo across the Pacific: Japan will be an ally, not a vassal. The words hit harder than any missile, cutting straight through 70 years of quiet diplomacy. Within hours, Tokyo's streets filled with people waving the red and white flag of the rising sun. From Osaka to Yokohama, they chanted the same phrase: dignity before dependency. For ordinary citizens, this wasn't about tariffs or car prices. It was about identity, about refusing to be seen as a nation that simply obeys. Commentators from Bloomberg to the Financial Times called it a new Meiji moment, comparing Takai's bold stance to Japan's 19th-century transformation from isolation to independence. Inside her cabinet, the decision had already been made: selected U.S. imports would be suspended immediately. Washington had drawn a line in the sand, and Tokyo had just stepped over it. Analysts called the move reckless. Takai called it necessary. When someone taxes your dignity, she said quietly, you stop selling it. The global reaction was instant. Stock tickers froze, Asian markets shook. Oil prices slipped as traders tried to make sense of what they were witnessing. But in Japan, the message was clear. For the first time since 1945, their nation wasn't following orders. It was setting the terms. Across the Pacific, in the White House Situation Room, aides scrambled for talking points. But Takai had already stolen the narrative. Japan's defiance wasn't just about trade. It was a declaration of sovereignty, and her next move would prove that the battlefield was shifting from factories to finance. The warning came without drama, just a calm statement delivered live from Tokyo's National Diet. If Washington uses tariffs as a weapon, Prime Minister Sai Takai said, Tokyo will strike at the heart of the American economy. No shouting. No anger, just precision, and everyone knew what she meant. Japan wasn't talking about ships or soldiers, it was talking about money, the lifeblood of America's empire. For decades, Japan had been the quiet banker behind the dollar's strength. It holds over $1.1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds, nearly 14% of all American debt owned by foreign nations. Those bonds were once a symbol of trust, a silent handshake between allies. But that trust was now breaking. In a single line, Takai had reminded the world that the United States' biggest creditor was no longer obedient. Inside Tokyo's financial district, traders stared at screens flashing red. Treasury panic, one Bloomberg alert read. Within hours, the Dow Jones plunged 600 points. Bond yields spiked. The word whispered through Wall Street was contagion. Because if Japan sold even 10% of its holdings, analysts warned, U.S. borrowing costs could soar by hundreds of billions of dollars. The effect would be devastating, mortgages rising, credit tightening, markets spiraling. And it wouldn't stop with Japan. If Tokyo made the first move, others might follow. South Korea, Singapore, even the European Central Bank. America's control over global credit could collapse overnight. For 70 years, Japan financed America's wars, deficits, and dreams. Now it was hinting that the loan might be called back. Economists labeled it financial diplomacy, but the truth ran deeper. This was rebellion, quiet, calculated, and carried out in spreadsheets instead of strikes. And it was only the beginning. Because Japan's real plan wasn't to destroy the dollar, it was to outgrow it. Behind the closed doors of Japan's Ministry of Finance, the order was simple but historic. Activate the Yen Strategy Task Force. That single sentence marked the beginning of what economists would soon call a financial revolution. For decades, nearly every major transaction in Asia, from oil to electronics, was settled in US dollars. The greenback wasn't just a currency, it was control. But under Prime Minister Sai Takai, Japan decided to break that spell. The new plan had a name, currency pluralism, a bold initiative designed to reduce Asia's dependence on the US dollar and restore the yen's sovereignty. According to leaked reports, the strategy unfolded in 3 calculated phases. Phase 1, expand regional trade settlements in yen, letting Asian countries bypass the dollar in everyday deals. Phase 2, support ASEAN's digital currency corridor, building the tech infrastructure to move money directly across borders. Phase 3, create bilateral currency swaps with India, Indonesia, and South Korea, forming a safety net that could rival Washington's financial influence. If even 20% of Asia's $4.5 trillion annual trade switched away from the dollar, analysts warned, global demand for USD could fall by 5–7%. That's enough to spike US interest rates, jolt Wall Street, and shake the very foundation of American dominance. But Japan's move wasn't revenge, it was rebalancing. While Washington weaponized tariffs, Tokyo weaponized trust. It wasn't burning bridges, it was building alternatives. In a single masterstroke, Japan turned finance into diplomacy. As reports of the yen revolution spread across Asia, a quiet realization took hold. The balance of power was shifting not through war or politics, but through money itself. The dollar had ruled for generations, but the yen was now demanding respect. And Tokyo's next step would prove just how serious it was. The turning point came not in Tokyo or Washington, but in Singapore beneath the shimmering glass dome of the Marina Bay Convention Center. Cameras clicked, pens scratched, and 3 prime ministers, from Japan, South Korea, and Australia, signed what would become the most ambitious regional pact in modern history, a $200 billion innovation fund called the Asian Renaissance. The headline stunned Washington. This wasn't another bureaucratic trade deal, it was a direct answer to America's dominance in technology and industry. The fund's purpose was crystal clear: to make Asia self-sufficient in semiconductors, batteries, and clean energy, the beating heart of tomorrow's global economy. For the first time, Asia wasn't waiting for permission. It was writing its own playbook. Prime Minister Sai Takai called it a partnership of purpose, not dependence. In Seoul, President Han Min-woo declared, Asia has stopped assembling for others and started inventing for itself. And in Canberra, Australia's Lydia Grant added a line that echoed across the Pacific. The 21st century won't belong to the loudest nation, it will belong to the smartest one. The numbers told their own story. This new alliance was 4 times larger than Washington's CHIPS Act. Analysts estimated that if even half the planned investments took root, Asia's share of the global tech supply chain could jump from 37% to nearly 60% within a decade, surpassing both the US and the EU. Across Asia, optimism spread like wildfire. Universities launched new engineering programs. Venture capital funds poured in billions. And for the first time, startups in Osaka, Busan, and Melbourne stood shoulder to shoulder with Silicon Valley giants. America called it a soft divorce. But for millions across the Pacific, it felt like something far greater, a rebirth of confidence. The West had defined progress for a century. Now Asia was taking the pen. When the news of Japan's $200 billion alliance hit Washington, it wasn't disbelief that filled the air, it was fear. By dawn, the lights in the White House Situation Room were still burning. Donald Trump's voice cracked through the static of a secure call. If Japan wants independence, then let them pay for it. The words were cold, deliberate, and designed to remind the world that America still held military cards Tokyo couldn't match. Within hours, the National Security Council convened an emergency meeting. Pentagon officials, trade advisors, and intelligence chiefs huddled around a single topic: leverage. Reports leaked to Politico revealed that Washington was quietly considering strategic force realignments in the Pacific. It was code for one word: Okinawa. For 75 years, the island had been the cornerstone of American power in Asia, home to 30,000 troops and billions in defense infrastructure. But now, the unthinkable was on the table, scaling down the U.S. military presence. Some in the Pentagon called it leverage. Others called it suicidal. Pulling out wouldn't just weaken Japan, it would shake the entire Indo-Pacific security architecture built since 1945. Markets reacted immediately. Moody's warned that a rupture in U.S.-Japan relations could destabilize over $1.2 trillion in cross-border investments. Goldman Sachs predicted that even a symbolic withdrawal could trigger a chain reaction from Seoul to Frankfurt. By midday, the Dow plunged 700 points, but this crisis was no longer about numbers. It was about meaning. For decades, America saw itself as Asia's protector, the architect of global order. Now, one of its oldest allies was rewriting that order from within without firing a single shot. And as Washington scrambled to appear strong, something unexpected happened. The louder America spoke, the more the world heard uncertainty. While Washington fumed, Tokyo built. Within weeks of the diplomatic storm, Prime Minister Sai Takai stood before Parliament once again, announcing a sweeping plan that would redefine Japan's future: the Industrial Renaissance Act. It wasn't just legislation, it was a statement of intent. A declaration that Japan's comeback wouldn't rely on foreign favors or borrowed strength. This was about self-reliance, innovation, and national pride. The numbers were staggering. $180 billion in new public-private investment, the largest economic package since the post-war reconstruction. The goal: to rebuild Japan's technological and manufacturing backbone: semiconductors, renewable energy, robotics, and defense production. Every yen spent was a blueprint for independence. Within days, the markets roared to life. Local chip startups surged 40%, venture capital inflows doubled, and Japan's household confidence hit its highest level in a decade. But this was more than an economic boom, it was a cultural awakening. Across universities, research labs, and corporate boardrooms, a new slogan appeared on posters and billboards: "Make Japan Respected Again." It was a quiet but pointed contrast to Trump's "Make America Great Again." Where one sought power through dominance, the other pursued dignity through discipline. Factories reopened in Osaka and Nagoya. Women entered leadership positions in record numbers. And for the first time in 30 years, Japan's GDP growth outpaced Germany's, sending shockwaves through Europe's financial circles. Yet beneath the optimism, one question lingered: could Japan's independence thrive without igniting new rivalries? Could economic confidence coexist with global cooperation? In the glow of neon Tokyo, surrounded by the hum of factories and the optimism of youth, Japan seemed to have found its answer: progress without arrogance. But as history had always shown, power, even earned through discipline, never comes without consequence. It all came full circle, 40 years after the Plaza Accord of 1985, when Washington forced Tokyo to weaken the yen to save the US dollar. Back then, Japan bowed to American pressure, sacrificing its currency strength to maintain an alliance built on imbalance. But in 2025, the story reversed. Tokyo no longer played by America's script, it was writing its own. The contrast was breathtaking. In Washington, debt climbed past $35 trillion, the dollar strained under the weight of deficits, and inflation haunted everyday families. Across the Pacific, Japan stood calm, its yen steady, its factories humming, its leadership confident. Economists called it a realignment of dignity. Politicians called it a warning. But historians saw something deeper: the end of an era where the United States dictated terms and allies obeyed. Factories once built to serve American demand were now fueled by domestic innovation. Investors who once poured billions into U.S. bonds were turning toward Asia's new growth markets. And a generation that grew up under Washington's shadow was finally stepping into its own light. But Japan's leaders were cautious. They knew that power without humility had destroyed empires before. Independence, they said, must walk hand in hand with wisdom. Prime Minister Takai reminded the nation that strength isn't about control, it's about character. Neither side, she said, can afford chaos. The world doesn't need another war of egos, it needs a balance of respect. As the Pacific night deepened, Tokyo's skyline glowed like a quiet declaration. America had once made Japan bend. Now Japan stood tall not as a rival, but as a reminder that discipline can outlast dominance. And for the first time in modern history, the question wasn't whether the world could survive without U.S. leadership, but whether it was finally ready to. The story that began with tariffs ends with transformation. What Donald Trump once saw as a show of strength has now become the symbol of America's unraveling influence and Japan's rebirth. In less than a year, the world watched the impossible happen. A nation long seen as Washington's junior partner standing tall as an equal, even a leader. What began with a trade war ended with a power shift from dependency to dignity. Tokyo didn't fight with missiles or military posturing. It fought with patience, strategy, and precision, the same qualities that built Japan from the ashes of 1945 into a technological giant. Prime Minister Sai Takai understood something her predecessors only whispered, that true power isn't loud. It's quiet, disciplined, and rooted in self-respect. While America swung tariffs like weapons, Japan built alliances, reshaped finance, and redefined progress. Across the Pacific, analysts now admit what Washington refuses to say: the post-war order has fractured. The dollar's supremacy is fading. The era of one-sided loyalty is ending. And in its place stands a new kind of leadership, cooperative, calculated, and unapologetically Asian. For the first time in generations, the world sees Japan not as America's shadow, but as a sovereign force shaping its own destiny. The yen is strong, the factories are alive, and the nation's confidence burns brighter than ever. So as dawn breaks over the Pacific, the question isn't who won the trade war, it's who evolved from it. Because history doesn't always belong to the loudest voice. Sometimes it belongs to the calmest one. And on this morning, as the rising sun cuts through the clouds above Tokyo, one truth is undeniable: the world has changed. This is cross-border news, where power, pride, and politics collide.